No matter what category you fit into this evening, I would just encourage you to have a good time, use your imagination. The more imagination you have this evening, the more fun you're going to have. So, having said that, we'll start with the stories now. The CNE is a very historic area of Toronto. There was a lot of things going on here, even long before the CNE started. The town of York, which was the predecessor of the city of Toronto, started in 1793. And just less than 20 years after the town was established, war broke out. This was the War of 1812, and it began in June of 1812 when the Americans declared war on the British Empire. And instead of sailing all the way across the Atlantic, they decided to invade Canada. Now, the first few months of the war didn't go very well for the Americans. They needed a PR victory, so they decided to invade the town of York. And this battle took place on April the 27th, 1813. The town was just 20 years old. There were only about 700 or 800 people living in the town, if you can believe it, at that time. But you can imagine how terrified they would have been to wake up that morning and see enemy ships on the harbor. And they were just on the other side past the Dufferin Gates. The American troops started to land and they fought their way east towards Fort York. If you're unfamiliar with the fort, it's just on the other side of Strachan Avenue over there, and they began to battle their way over. Some of the Aboriginals who were loyal to the Crown came out and they skirmished for about half an hour with the American invaders. And they were the ones that really proved themselves to be heroes on that day. But they were vastly outnumbered and they fled into the woods. Just outside the gates here, there was a artillery battery, and they began to try to stop the Americans from advancing. But there was an accidental explosion, and this battery blew up, killing dozens of British soldiers. The Americans continued towards the east. They found themselves outside Fort York. If you've ever been out to Fort York, they were just outside the area that is now the parking lot where you buy your admission tickets. And the troops in the fort decided not to fight to defend the town. They were going to surrender. They snuck out the east side, up that ramp that leads towards Bathurst today. And they left a small complement of men to destroy the gunpowder magazine that was in the fort. And this gunpowder magazine was sealed in big 6-foot thick stone walls. The reason they wanted to destroy it is they didn't want it to fall into American hands, because this is what both the British and the American guns and cannon were powered by. So they left a long wick, and this eventually exploded after the fort had been abandoned by the British and the Canadians. This was the second most powerful explosion in the entire history of the British Army. And big pieces of rock were thrown over the walls of the fort. The American commander was a man by the name of Zebulon Pike. He had seen the flag flying over the walls of the fort, and he thought he was going to have to fight to defend the fort. He was interrogating some prisoners when this explosion took place, and one of these big pieces of rock flew over the walls of the fort and crushed him, and he was killed instantly, and the Americans were outraged by this. In that explosion, nearly 40 American soldiers were killed outright. Well over 200 died over the next couple of days as a result of their injuries, and there were several graveyards right between where we're standing and the walls of the fort where the war dead from the Battle of York in 1813 were killed. Now, the fort today is a very, very haunted place. There are several stories told. There's a story of one of the old guards at the fort who still patrols the walls outside the fort, and he's still seen on duty 200 years later. Several years ago, one of the reservists, the military men who was at the fort, stationed at the fort, was jogging around the walls, and an unseen force grabbed him and pulled him down off the walls of the fort. And we think it was the ghost of this soldier. The ghost of the soldier physically assaulted this man, but we think the ghost was actually trying to do him a favor. He was pulling him away from those American sharpshooters that came here 200 years ago that might have actually killed him. Now, in the officers' barracks in the fort, there's a kitchen. And that said, the officers' quarters is said to be one of the most haunted buildings within the fort. There's the sound, the awareness of a presence in the kitchen. One of the old cooking staff is in there. Whoever it is heard clanking and cluttering around. Whoever it is likes to slam the doors of the fort. And if you've ever been down there, you know the size of the fort. They don't blow open in the wind. The doors are very, very substantial. Also, in the dining room of the officers' quarters, there's a dinner party. Some of the officers still congregate 200 years afterwards, and they are seen by silhouette as people are leaving the fort. They're seen in the dining hall of the officers' quarters. So if you get the chance to tour the fort, there's a lot of different ghost stories here. Now, this other building that I want to talk about from here is just through the trees. You can't see it very well from here, but it's called the General Services Building, and it was built in 1910. For several years, for several decades, it was used as a hydropower electric station. And in October of 1924, there was an explosion. Now, nobody was killed in the explosion here, but the repair crews came in, and the next day after the explosion, there was a man repairing some of the wiring, trying to work on some of the wiring downstairs, and he was tragically, fatally electrocuted. And he still comes back. His apparition has been reported in the General Services Building. He's described, when they see his apparition, it's pretty gruesome. He's seen as a charred figure from his electrocution, and apparently he seems quite angry at the fact that his life ended so unexpectedly and so early as a young man. There are a lot of different ghost stories there.